So welcome back, and now we are going to hear Greg Bochner talk about transparency and a posteriori physicalism.
Thanks a lot. So we have 5 minutes delay, so just want to point that out. Okay, so I'm going to present work in progress, applying some ideas about thought and reference that I have to the knowledge argument and the hard problem of consciousness. So I'm very much interested in the relations between three puzzles: Frege's puzzle, the essential indexical, and the knowledge argument. So in each of these puzzles, we can pose a puzzle with an identity statement that, if true, is a posteriori. So there is an epistemic gap in each of these cases. So if we take Frege's puzzle, Hesperus is a priori, Hesperus is phosphorus is a posteriori, but according to a Kripkean semantics, the two statements express the same necessary proposition, true at all possible worlds, because the names are rigid, they designate the same thing in all worlds, namely Venus. And so Kripke says it's impossible that Hesperus not be phosphorus. There is no possibility in which that statement is false. But nevertheless, of course, before we knew that the identity was true, it seemed possible to us that it be false. So it seems that there is a possibility in which some kind of similar statement is false. So there is an intuition of contingency. It does not come from the official content of the statement, which is a necessary proposition, but from some other contingent content in the background somehow. And that's because we have two ways of thinking about Venus. So we have the Hesperus way as the evening star, and we have the phosphorus way as the morning star. These are contingent ways of thinking about Venus, and they are contingently related. So you might learn that the evening star is the morning star, and that's where the intuition of contingency comes from. It's a real contingency, but not of the necessary proposition that is officially expressed, but by another proposition in the background that is contingent. So that's Kripkean recipe. It applies also in the Kaplan form of the semantics for indexicals. Lingens is a priori, but I am lingens for the amnesiac lingens is not a priori. And the reason is that there is a contingent way of thinking about lingens. Okay? So Kripke himself provided that sort of blueprint of two-dimensionalism, distinguishing the necessary content and the contingent content in the background, but he claimed famously that this does not apply to the phenomenal case, because in that particular case, we don't think about our experiences via some contingent way of thinking about the experience. Okay? So when Mary discovers this is what it's like to see red, okay, we can assume that we can take Mary and we can take Mariana. So Mariana is just like Mary. She's in the room, in the black and white room, and she hasn't seen colors. And then she's presented with slides of colors, red, blue, green, but not taught the names of these colors. So in the Mariana situation, it's just like Mary, but she has the phenomenal concepts and she has the phenomenal experiences. Okay, so she can still discover that this is what it's like to see red. And there is something, it seems, that she rules out when she learns that, so she can acquire this new piece of knowledge. But Kripke says that this cannot be explained via a contingent mode of presentation in the background, because we think of our experiences in a sort of direct way. So the explanation that he gives for the Hesperus phosphorus case cannot be applied, according to him, to the case of consciousness, where there is no gap between appearance and reality. The way an experience looks just is the way it is. So there is no contingent way of thinking about the experience. So that's a problem for physicalism, of course, because then if there is no way to explain away the intuition that the statement is contingently true, then there must be a possibility in which it is false, and if there is a possibility in which it is false, it is false. Okay, so that's the argument for dualism and inferring from an epistemic gap to an ontological gap. So I'm interested in how we can explain the intuition of contingency in this case if we would like to stick to physicalism, like many other people working in that area, so the phenomenal concept strategy, there are two ways of thinking about one and the same property, but it's not a priori that they refer to the same property. So I will introduce two distinctions, one epistemic, the other semantic. So the epistemic distinction is one between one transparency principle, the Kripkean transparency principle revelation, according to which we get a direct insight into the experience itself or its nature maybe, when we have it and when we think about it via a phenomenal concept. And on the other hand, the transparency that is relevant to Frege's puzzle, the transparency of sense and the transparency of mental content, as Paul Boghossian has called that. And on the other hand, another semantic distinction between the classical two-dimensionalism, this is a family of views inspired by Kripke and Kaplan, and almost everybody is in that camp today, and my own pragmatic two-dimensionalism, which is inspired by David Lewis's account about the Dessay attitudes. So what I want to do is first emphasize that Boghossian's transparency of sense actually plays a crucial role also in the knowledge argument. Actually, I think it plays the most important role. And I want to argue that the knowledge argument boils down to a conflict between two-dimensional semantics, classical two-dimensionalism, because it shapes the way in which we see the problems actually. And if we think about the problems within that framework, there will be a difficulty and we will end up being dualist, and that's kind of what, for instance, David Chalmers would be doing. Boghossian's transparency and a posteriori physicalism. So I think that's the real conflict. I will argue for that. And then my proposal would be to maybe we can try and keep physicalism by giving up classical two-dimensionalism and endorsing instead the pragmatic two-dimensionalism that I'm recommending. So I will introduce some background ideas that I have about Frege's puzzle and the essential indexical, mainly to introduce the two distinctions that I want to make, the epistemic and the semantic distinction. So what's Frege's puzzle? So Hesperus is a priori, Hesperus phosphorus is a posteriori. How can that be, given that the two names refer to the same thing, namely the planet Venus? First, there is a datum, and that's the opacity of reference. It's just a fact that the competent speaker mastering the two names is not able to know a priori that the referents are the same. That's just a fact, and it's a comparative notion of opacity here. We can't tell a priori whether they are the same or distinct. Now, given the opacity of reference, I think that Frege's puzzle just boils down to a conflict between two theses about content, referentialism and transparency. So, according to referentialism, the contents of our thoughts can be referential. They can incorporate a referent from the environment. So, when I think about that tree, the tree itself is part of the content. And transparency, which claims that the contents of our thoughts are transparent in the sense that I can know a priori for any two thoughts of mine at the same time, whether they have the same content or not. So given the opacity of reference and referentialism, it follows that contents are opaque, and that contradicts transparency. And I think that this is Frege's puzzle. There is nothing more to Frege's puzzle. Without transparency, there is no puzzle at all, because you can say, well, he doesn't know that the two contents are the same, so what? It's only until you add the transparency principle, there is no problem, and once you add it, there is a problem. So I think Frege, this is the relevant transparency principle, so it's the comparative transparency principle articulated by Boghossian. It comes from Frege, but Boghossian admirably articulated it in the 94 paper. So this is the thesis that for any two occurrent thoughts at some time, the subject at that time is able to know a priori whether the thoughts have the same or distinct contents. Okay? That's a comparative transparency principle. It's not the same as Kripkean transparency, I will claim later. So Frege presupposes transparency. He does not articulate it, and he doesn't feel the need to justify his commitment to transparency, but it's there nonetheless, because otherwise there is no puzzle at all. And he keeps transparency and jettisons referentialism. That's his solution. So he endorses descriptivism, according to which we grasp only general contents containing not the reference but general characterizations of the referent. So that solves the puzzle. That solves this particular puzzle. So Hesperus is Hesperus means that the evening star is the evening star. That's trivial. And Hesperus is Phosphorus means that the evening star is the morning star, and that is informative. So that's a perfect solution to that puzzle. It creates other problems, but it's a perfect solution to that problem. Now, I think that Frege was essentially right about the problem and about the solution. So the solution is we grasp only general content. So I'm almost alone here, but maybe David Lewis would be with me. So his mistake was not to think that we grasp only general contents, I think, but to think that contents are true or false, that they have absolute truth values, that they have complete truth conditions. Contents and truth conditions are two different notions. And we can see that once we move to a modal framework. So I think the best way to understand what we are doing in possible world semantics is precisely to say that our notion of content becomes now a proposition, and the proposition is not true or false. It is true or false relative to a circumstance of evaluation, which in the first phase is just a possible world. Now, one and the same proposition can have different truth values at different worlds, so it's not true or false in itself. Right? So we relativize truth values to circumstances. And once we do that, we no longer have the equivalence between contents and truth conditions. It's a content, a proposition, plus a particular world of evaluation that becomes the object that is true or false, that has absolute truth conditions. And that is what François calls an Austinian proposition in his book Perspectival Thought. Okay? So once we move to the modal framework, we accept Frege's lesson that we grasp only general contents. We now have propositions that are true or false at worlds. And I think the best way to understand what is going on in the essential indexical, so there are many questions about what the problem is, I think that's the only way to understand what is going on in the problem. Lingens, the amnesiac, reads a biography of himself. He comes to know all the objective truth about himself. Nevertheless, there is something he doesn't learn from the book. I am Lingens, as he might say, so what's going on? So he's reading the biography, he learns all the general propositions of the form, the man called Lingens is F, true at his world, but nevertheless he can still learn something about himself. Okay, so that's not a surprise, because the only contents that he can grasp are general propositions. Okay, so he knows all the general propositions, so the proposition he learns cannot be a general proposition. And what he learns obviously has referential truth conditions. So do we need singular propositions? I don't think so. So we can just emphasize there is a difference between content, which is general, and truth conditions, which are referential, because they involve not only a content, but also a particular circumstance of evaluation. So that's the Lewisian move, actually. That's what Lewis says. So the content of what Lingens learns is not a proposition. He has learned all of them. But it's a property, it's a general property. But that's not enough to get a truth value. Of course, you need a circumstance of evaluation, and the property is to be evaluated at a centered world, or a world centered on a particular individual, a possible individual, an actual individual. And once you put these two things together, you have a complete truth condition. So the truth conditions are referential even though the content is general. Now I think that this is enough, actually. We can have a referential notion of truth conditions without having a referential notion of content. It's much better to do that because our contents can then remain general and they can still conform to a principle of transparency, Bogosian's transparency. Now, there are problems with Lewis's account, but there are two components in his account: properties and egocentrism. So according to Lewis, we always self-ascribe the properties. So all of my attitudes are self-ascriptions of some property. And all of your attitudes are self-ascriptions of some property. So this creates problems, as was emphasized also in the last workshop, these last days with dynamics of beliefs. So one problem is communication, so across different subjects. So I'm talking only about myself, you're talking only about yourself. But so we need to translate what the other person says in terms that refer to us. Okay? So that involves a lot of complications in the theory of communication, and communication seems simple and straightforward, so that's not a good point. Another problem is intellectualism. So according to Lewis, I am the only referential anchor of all my thoughts. So I can refer to myself directly because I self-ascribe properties, but I cannot refer directly to any other object in the world. For any other object, when I have a dere thought about that tree in the garden, I need to describe that object in terms of its relations to me. So when I'm thinking that tree is in bloom, that will mean that the tree I am now seeing is in bloom, or something like that. Okay. So we need to internalize the acquaintance relations, and that's not a good point because there may be cases of ignorance or mistake, and some creatures less sophisticated than us might not be able to describe their causal relations to things in the environment. Many primitive creatures perceive the world and can perhaps think about objects directly, but are not able to, do not have the conceptual resources to describe their relations to the objects. So these are two famous reasons to resist the egocentrist account. But we could also keep the properties without the egocentrism. Lewis wanted egocentrism for a variety of reasons. He wanted to stick to the policy of assigning a uniform category of objects to attitudes, as he says. Okay, so if you want to do that, you have to move from propositions to properties. But you might also give up that egocentrism and say, well, when I have a demonstrative thought about that tree, I ascribe the property of being bloom, that's a set of possible individuals, directly to the object itself, which is the tree, at that time in the actual world. And there you have referential truth conditions, and you have a general content, something that is satisfied by different possible individuals. Okay. So if we do that, there are a number of consequences. So one of them is that I can now think about any old object in my environment. So there is no privileged circumstance for each of my thoughts. I can think about any object, and maybe I can think about the whole world as well. So there are different kinds of circumstances. Correspondingly, there will be different kinds of contents. Some of my thoughts will have property contents, others will have propositional contents. That's fine as well. Another consequence of this account is going to be that it's no longer the case that for each thought there is just one circumstance of evaluation. So maybe we have thoughts with different circumstances of evaluations in them, or multi-centered worlds. So when I think John gave the book to Mary, we have a three-place predicate, and we might construe it as, you know, a set of triples, and these are possible individuals. And we might evaluate that at John in the actual world, the book in the actual world, and Mary in the actual world. So that's one way we can go. But that means we don't have this idea that comes from Kaplan and to which Lewis sticks as well, that we have only one circumstance for each thought. So I think this is exactly what is going on then in the case of identity statements. So on this account, an identity statement is no longer necessary. So it expresses a truth condition. So in the case of Hesperus' phosphorus, it is true just in case we have one circumstance, that's the actual world centered on Venus, and another circumstance, that's the actual world centered on Venus as well, and we are now claiming that these two circumstances are the same. So the content is just the identity relation, the set of pairs of objects that are identical, and the statement has two circumstances, and the content is the statement is just true or false. It is not necessarily true or contingently true. It is just true because an Austinian proposition contains a particular circumstance. In this case, it contains two circumstances. So it's no longer the kind of object that can be necessary or contingent. It's only true or false because it specifies all the parameters on which the true value will depend. It does not abstract away from any determinant of truth value. Okay. So this gives us a notion that is referential. The identity statement is referential, and assertions in general can be referential and anchored in the actual world, but it's not a modal notion, according to this account. Okay, so that's a crucial difference with Kripkean semantics. But on the other hand, I will have another notion. So I'm claiming that the identity statement is just true or false, but it looks contingent, right? And that's the case not just with identity statements on this account. When I look out the window and I see it's raining, I'm thinking it's raining in Paris now in the actual world. That's what makes my statement true or false, right? But the fact that it's raining in Paris in the actual world is not a contingent fact, right? If it's raining at that time in that place in the actual world, it's a necessary fact. So this means that Austinian propositions cannot have another true value than the one that they have. Okay? That's the case for all empirical assertions that target some part of the actual world. Okay? So once we have that, we have to explain where the intuition of contingency comes from for identity statements and also for its raining. I do have the intuition that my statement is informative when I tell you it is raining, right? Even though what I say is not contingently true. And I'm claiming that this comes from a second level of meaning, the second dimension of my two-dimensional pragmatics. So that's because the circumstance that I target with my assertion is opaque, because it involves the reference. So I have a mode of presentation of that circumstance that contains a set of alternatives for what that circumstance might be. Okay. So that's a non-rigid mode of presentation of the circumstance in question. So this is the content in the background that will explain the informativeness, the contingency, and all that. Okay, so we have a truth condition, and we also have another notion, which is informativeness condition, based on that mode of presentation. So Hesperus' phosphorus is going to be informative just in case the two contingent modes of presentation that I have of Hesperus and phosphorus, the evening star and the morning star, when you intersect these sets of possible individuals, you rule out some possibility, some possible individual. And now notice that this notion is, of course, not referential because it's transparent, does not appeal to any fact about a reference in the actual world, does not mention the actual world at all. It is transparent because it is purely modal. So I don't have to know a priori anything about my environment in order to know this notion of meaning. It's totally independent of the contingent facts about the actual world. So that's how it can stay a priori for me. Okay. So I have these two notions, and I should emphasize the first one on my account, the referential notion, is the primary notion. And the second one is the secondary notion. That's contrary to what happens in classical two-dimensionalism. Here, sense does not determine reference. You have reference fixed via some causal relation, and only in a second time do you get modes of presentation that represent that reference that was independently fixed. And it represents it in a contingent way here. Okay. So in the matrix here, we have two concepts. So Hesperus is phosphorus. They are associated each with a circumstance. The circumstance is the same, so that truth condition is just true. Okay, it's not necessarily true. And we have also modes of presentation, the contents in the background, the contents that I believe about Hesperus and phosphorus respectively. And that's a set of possible individuals. The individuals are stars, centered worlds where the center is a star. So this is the set of possible evening stars. That's the set of possible morning stars. And when I learn that Hesperus is phosphorus, I just eliminate the possible individuals that are not in both sets. So that's where the contingency comes from. Now notice that in this account, Venus is not even part of the contents here, okay? That's because the modes of presentation are false of Venus. Venus is not a star, it's a planet. So the mode of presentation is false. But we are not vulnerable to Kripke's arguments from error and ignorance because reference is fixed first, independently of the mode of presentation. So the mode of presentation can be false, and that's going to be important for the discussion. Now the contents are transparent. Before I knew that Hesperus is phosphorus, the sets were not the same, and I knew this a priori. Now that I know that Hesperus is phosphorus, the sets are the same, and I know this a priori. So on this sort of pragmatic two-dimensional accounts, we never grasp singular contents about ordinary objects. Modes of presentation are general contents. They conform to Bogosian's transparency, and so far I'm in complete agreement with Frege. But I add that they are believed of a circumstance, of a possibility. That's something that Frege was not seeing because he did not have an interest in modal issues and he did not have the possible world semantics that we have. Contrary to what Frege says, sense does not determine reference here. Modes of presentation don't fix the reference. They don't fix the circumstance. And that means that they need not be known, because if they are known, they must be true. Here they can be believed, and they can be falsely believed, or they can be incomplete. Okay. So the modes of presentation, because they don't fix reference, can be just believed, and that's not, we cannot argue against that view with Kripke's arguments from error and ignorance. On the other hand, they don't contribute to truth conditions, but just to informativeness conditions, contrary to what Frege says. Now, there are two important differences with classical two-dimensionalism. So according to classical two-dimensionalism, we do grasp singular contents, and sense continues to fix reference. So in the classical two-dimensionalism, we have one matrix for Hesperus, another one for Hesperus, phosphorus. Okay, so first of all, so the context here, the worlds on the vertical axis are the situations in which we speak or think. The circumstances are the situations in which, about which we think or speak. And so relative to each context, we have a different proposition represented by a list of true values at circumstances here. So that's a set of possibilities compatible with the proposition. So this is just a function from context to content. So this is just a character, except that these are my epistemic alternatives, or you can construe that as you like. But so this is just a character of some kind. It's a function from context to content. Okay. So according to two-dimensionalism, I do grasp the same proposition. It's a singular proposition. But I don't realize this a priori that it's the same. Why is that? Because of ignorance of the context. That's the key notion according to two-dimensionalism. So I do know a priori which proposition is expressed by Hesperus, and that's reflected in the fact that it's the same horizontal line relative to each of my alternatives. So I know exactly which horizontal proposition is expressed by Hesperus. That's how it is a priori. Okay. But I don't know exactly which proposition is expressed by Hesperus phosphorus because I don't know certain contingent facts about the actual world that are relevant to determining what is said. Okay. So maybe in that world, the evening star is Mars, and Mars is not identical to Venus. Okay. So here the horizontal propositions are not the same, and so I don't know exactly which proposition is expressed, whether it's necessarily true or necessarily false proposition. And what I grasp is just the diagonal proposition. And the diagonal is not going to coincide with the horizontal precisely because it's not the same horizontal proposition expressed in all of my alternatives. So the diagonal is going to be contingent, and this will reflect what I know about the truth value of the statement, whatever it says in the actual world, whatever it is. Okay? So I don't know the truth value of the statement because I don't know what is said exactly. In order to know what is said, I need contingent information about the world in which I speak or think. I need to eliminate possible contexts, basically. So that's what happens when I learn that the evening star is the morning star. I now eliminate some alternatives, and then I can see a priori, given that information at that time, that it's the same proposition here and there, and at that particular moment I can see that it's the same horizontal content, but not before. Okay. So horizontal contents are not going to be transparent, but diagonal propositions are going to be. They will play the role of modes of presentation. So according to classical 2D, we do grasp singular contents, but we don't always know a priori which singular content we grasp. Sometimes, in order to know which horizontal content we are grasping, we need to know contingent facts about the context in which we speak, and we need information that eliminates some possible context until the diagonal and the horizontal come to coincide. So here the horizontal propositions do not conform to Boghossian's transparency, but the diagonal propositions do, and they play the role of transparent modes of presentation. And they continue to play, like in Frege, the role of what determines reference. So it's character that determines content relative to a context, its primary intention that determines a secondary intention relative to a world considered as actual. So we still have that sort of order of explanation. Now, let's take Mary to the argument. So Mary has been locked in a black and white room for all her life. She's never seen colors. She has studied all the textbooks available about the physics of brain processes underlying the vision of colors. She has all the relevant physical information. Nevertheless, she doesn't know what it's like to see red. Okay? And she doesn't have the phenomenal concept either. Okay? So when she comes out of the room, she will acquire a phenomenal concept and also phenomenal knowledge. Now let's take Mariana. She's just like Mary. She's in the room once again, but at some point, that's a case that comes from Martine and Ida Rumelin. So at some point in the room, she's shown slides of different colors, but no recognizable objects. So she doesn't know the names of these colors. So now she has a phenomenal concept of seeing red. She knows what it's like to see red, but she doesn't know how her phenomenal concept of seeing red relates to her physical knowledge of seeing red, seeing blue, seeing green. Okay? She doesn't know which is which. So that's an epistemic progress, because now she can contemplate new hypotheses. As Martine emphasizes, there are two steps of epistemic progress in the Mary case. Now she broadened her horizons of thought. She can conceive of new possibilities and she can ask new questions. But she doesn't know the answer to that question, which is which. Okay. So nevertheless, she knows what it's like, and she knows, knowing what it's like, it seems, in those debates, reveals something about the experience. So we have Kripke about pain, who says, pain is not picked out by one of its accidental properties, rather it's picked out by the property of being pain itself, by its immediate phenomenological quality. Thus pain, unlike heat, is not only rigidly designated by pain, but the reference of the designator is determined by an essential property of the referent. So I take this to be revelation. Revelation means no contingent mode of presentation associated with my way of thinking about pain, but it's ambiguous between two theses. So first, there is no separate mode of presentation. There is just the referent itself. Maybe the referent is the mode of presentation, but there is no separate mode of presentation fixing reference. That's one way to go. But another interpretation compatible with what Kripke says is that there is a mode of presentation which captures the essential properties of the experience. And those are really different interpretations, it seems. So correspondingly, there are two ways of understanding and fleshing out what Kripke says. We can say that phenomenal concepts are radically opaque and that they reveal neither essential nor accidental properties of the reference. That's Philip Gough's terminology. Or that they are transparent in the sense that they reveal the essence of the experience that they denote, or of their reference. Okay. So Philip says that a posteriori physicalism, type B physicalism, is naturally associated and implicitly associated in many authors with radical opacity. So he says, most type B physicalists agree with the Kripkean direct reference thesis that we do not pick out our conscious states in terms of non-essential appearance properties, but type B physicalists also tend to deny that phenomenal concepts reveal essential features of conscious states. The standard type B line is that phenomenal concepts reveal no substantive feature of their referent. Okay. I think that's what's at stake indeed in Brian Lohr or John Perry. Now, Brian McLaughlin says, phenomenal concepts are of two sorts, non-descriptive names and type demonstrative concepts. As such, phenomenal concepts lack any descriptive content. They do not conceptually reveal anything about the essential nature of phenomenal properties. They simply name or demonstrate them. So this brings us back to the debate before. So we can ask, if some concepts are radically opaque, what are their analogues in expressions in natural language? Can we? So what he suggests, McLaughlin, is type demonstratives. I think this is not right. So if you take the concept that person, on a standard Kaplanian semantics, you get the following character. So the character it's a rigid designator. Suppose I'm designating Julia, that person. And so that's a designator that is rigid. It refers to the same thing in all circumstances, but of course it does not designate the same thing in all contexts. So you get different horizontal lines that are necessary. But the point is that the diagonal here is going to be contingent. So that's just a way of saying that there is a posteriority in that kind of mode of presentation. There is a variation across contexts of the reference, and so there's a kind of contingency here that we don't want precisely. What Kripke says is that phenomenal concepts are not like that. They are not associated with a contingent mode of presentation. So demonstratives may not be a very good candidate from the start, but maybe million names are. So million names are just referred, so their meaning is exhausted by a referent, and that means that they have the same referent not only in all circumstances, so they are rigid, so the name Julia refers to Julia in all circumstances, but also in all contexts. They are context insensitive. So it's Julia in all contexts here. So they don't reveal any property of the referent. So maybe they are better candidates for understanding what a radically opaque concept might be. It's a concept that would yield a 2D matrix of that sort. Now, if you buy that claim, we have a first problem. So the first problem is that we get the same 2D matrix for radically opaque and transparent phenomenal concepts. So we just said that if a radically opaque concept is like a million name, it will have a constant 2D matrix, a constant two-dimensional function, context to contents. Okay? But if that's the case, we will have the same 2D matrix for the transparent content. The transparent content is the concept. That's also a rigid designator, right? And the difference is supposed to be that we have an a priori insight into the essence of the experience, but that's going to be exactly the same. So we will have necessity along the diagonal now. Okay. So we get exactly the same 2D matrices, whether we say that phenomenal concepts are radically opaque or whether we say that they are phenomenally transparent. And that's a limitation, I think, of the 2D framework, the classical 2D framework. It cannot express the difference in terms of 2D matrices between these two theses, which are very different. Now, once we have that, we have a further problem, and that's the real problem. So Mariana has a physical concept, P. That concept is rigid according to Kripke. One and the same brain state is necessarily the brain state it is. And she also has all the physical knowledge. And remember that the role of empirical knowledge is to exclude possible context here, so that you get the same horizontal line relative to each of the alternatives. So if that's the case, if she has all the physical information, the 2D matrix associated with her physical concept is constant. Okay, it's going to be the physical property everywhere. Now, given what we've just said about the phenomenal concept, Q, that she also has, okay, whether or not we say that the phenomenal concept is radically opaque or phenomenally transparent, we get the same 2D matrix as for the physical concept. And now we are in a very strange situation. Mariana has all the information that she might possibly have. She has the same 2D matrix on each side for each concept, and yet there is no way that she sees that they are the same. There is no a priori entailment between the two. And that's actually a violation of Boghossian's principle. She cannot tell a priori that the 2D matrices are the same, and she cannot even receive more empirical information, so she could not receive more information to cool. So if physicalism is true and classical two-dimensionalism is true, you cannot have Boghossian's transparency thesis. But there is another way to go. So you might also think that it's precisely the problem comes from the 2D matrix. So the problem arises, once again, given revelation understood as an ambiguous thesis, there is no contingent mode of presentation, but independently of the choice between radical opacity and transparency, because you get the same 2D matrix anyway. So I claim that the real conflict is a trilemma between a posteriori physicalism, Bogosian's transparency, and classical two-dimensionalism. So if we want to stick to Bogosian's transparency, which I think we do have to do, and to physicalism, we must reject the classical 2D way of seeing the problem. Okay. So I think that's here that in this debate, my pragmatic 2D might help. So remember, according to this, we don't grasp singular contents about ordinary objects, and sense does not determine reference. So these are two important differences, and you might develop an alternative account based on each of these two claims. So first option, you might say, phenomenal concepts are radically opaque. So that's associated with a posteriori physicalism. There is no mode of presentation at all. There is no separate mode of presentation. But here, unlike in the classical 2D, we can have concepts that have a referent, a circumstance, but no mode of presentation. That's because reference is fixed independently of the mode of presentation. So there might be concepts that have a circumstance or a referent, but no mode of presentation at all. That's not so if you think that sense determines reference. Of course, you need a sense. You need to go through the sense in order to find the referent. But here, the referent is found independently of the sense. So you might have concepts like that. And you might say phenomenal concepts are like that. So they have a referent, but they don't have any mode of presentation. So the idea would be the physical concept P has a referent and a general mode of presentation, but the phenomenal concept Q, which has the same physical reference, does not have any mode of presentation at all. So in learning the identity P equals Q, we do not rule out any possibility, simply because there is no content in which we could rule out possibilities, right? In order to rule out possibilities, you need two contents, to intersect two contents and to rule out certain possibilities. Here you cannot do that. So Bogosian's transparency here will not be violated because it applies only to pairs of contents. The principle says, when we have two contents, we know a priori whether they are the same or different. But here we don't have two contents. So the principle fails to apply. It doesn't fail, it just fails to apply. The question does not arise. So this would give us the following 2D matrix that's the same, but so we have the physical concept that has this particular referent. It's a centered world, centered on a particular experience. And we have the phenomenal concept that has the same referent. They are identical according to physicalism. But the physical concept is associated with a non-rigid mode of presentation. It's non-rigid in the sense that it's not the same experience in the center of all of my alternatives, right? Whereas the phenomenal concept is not associated with any set of alternatives. It doesn't have any content. Okay, so that's one way to go. We could add something here if we are not satisfied. We think phenomenal concepts do not just have phenomenal reference, but they also give some kind of knowledge, right? We could say Bogosian's transparency maybe in this exceptional case applies to circumstances. So it applies to the level here, the reference, so that I can compare a priori my concept of seeing red with my concept of seeing blue. I can tell a priori that they are different. In this exceptional case, the transparency would be the transparency of reference or circumstances. That would give us some piece of knowledge. It would be comparative knowledge in addition to the reference. But still, there would be no content here. Now, if we are not satisfied with that, maybe we think that phenomenal concepts really have a content and they provide us with substantive knowledge of the reference. So we might go for a transparency, phenomenal transparency idea. So the phenomenal concepts are transparent, they reveal the essence of the experience. And in this case, we can say that they have a content, and it's a singular content. It's a rigid mode of presentation. And that is a bit more in line with Russellian monism, according to which physics describes what matter does, but not what matter is. So it describes the relations between the physical entities, but is silent about the physical entities themselves and their intrinsic nature. Maybe this involves consciousness at some level. And here, the difference with the classical 2D is that, you know, in the classical 2D, you say, I grasp singular contents all the time. But here I say we never grasp singular contents about physical objects from the outside. And I can reserve my singular contents for a very special occasion. I can reserve them for the phenomenal case. I can now say in this exceptional case we have a mode of presentation and it's a singular mode of presentation. It is rigid. So the explanation would be just as before, the same referent for a physical concept and the phenomenal concept, but not the same content. The physical concept has a general mode of presentation, and the phenomenal concept has a singular mode of presentation. So there is no a priori entailment between the two. Bogosian's transparency is not violated because there is no a priori entailment between a singular content and the general content. So if you know that Lingens is German and that the amnesiac, it doesn't follow that the amnesiac lost in the Stanford Library is German and the other way around. So there is no a priori entailment and there is no violation of Bogosian's transparency. It's not the same set. It's not the same content. So here, in learning the identity, we would rule out some possibilities. But there is something special going on nevertheless, which might explain why it sounds unintelligible. The physical information will exclude only world parameters, whereas the phenomenal information will exclude only center parameters. So we get these matrices. So again, the physical concept is non-rigid in the sense that it's not the same experience in all of my alternatives. That's just a general mode of presentation of the experience. The phenomenal concept is now rigid, so it's the same experience in all of my alternatives. Okay. Now the physical concept tells us about how the world is around the experience. So it gives us some information about the world. It excludes world W2, W4, W6 that are still here. Okay? But it says nothing about the intrinsic nature of the experience. On the other hand, the phenomenal concept is maximally specific about what the experience is like, but maximally unspecific about the world around the experience is like. So it doesn't teach us anything about the world around the experience. So we would have that when we intersect these two contents, the phenomenal information will exclude all centers but one. Okay? What is compatible with what we know when we intersect these two things is just the experience E1. Okay? So phenomenal concepts narrow down the possibilities as to what the experience is like, but they don't tell us anything about the world around the experience. Okay? So they don't exclude any possibilities here. Whereas the physical concept is totally silent about the exact nature of the experience at the center here, but it does rule out some possibilities in the world parameters. So that you can see that these two concepts provide information that works in parallel. So that it seems that the information, the two concepts do not speak to each other. There are different kinds of information. One rules out centers, the other one rules out worlds. So that would explain why it seems unintelligible that there should be a connection between the two kinds of concepts. No amount of physical information will ever tell you what it's like, will ever narrow down your possibilities as to what it's like. And no amount of phenomenal information will rule out possibilities about the world around the experience. So that's something I can say because precisely I say that we don't grasp singular contents about ordinary objects. So I can reserve that contrast for that special occasion if I want to. But I'm not sure I want. So the conclusions are that I have said two things. So first, I've made a claim about the nature of the knowledge argument. I've argued that it boils down to a conflict between a posteriori physicalism, Bogosian's transparency, not Kripkean transparency, but Bogosian's transparency, and classical two-dimensionalism. And that's because of the way that we are accustomed to think. We do semantics and we are used to the Kaplanian framework and we think we grasp singular propositions, but actually if we look at the things, it shapes the way in which we look at the things. We can give up this way of thinking about the problems and then that's what I recommend as a solution. We can give up the classical two-dimensionalism. I think there are many reasons to give it up in favor of a pragmatic two-dimensionalism, and so we don't get the problematic prediction that the 2D matrices are the same for the phenomenal and the physical concepts. And there are two options available with that, so a lot of work to be done still, if that's a viable proposal. So first, phenomenal concepts are radically opaque, and a posteriori physicalism is true. So phenomenal concepts have a referent, but no mode of presentation. Bogosian's transparency doesn't fail, but just fails to apply. Or phenomenal concepts are transparent, and we endorse Russellian monism. Phenomenal concepts have a referent and a rigid mode of presentation, a singular content. And here, Bogosian's transparency of different applies. We know a priori that the contents are not the same. And there is no a priori entailment between the two. Okay, so thanks a lot.